What's going on? Alex here, and today I want to answer some tax questions from Reddit that seem to have a common theme associated with them, being that there's this $1,200 payment floating around given the new stimulus that was recently signed by Donald Trump. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Now, let me change the screen here, and as you can see, there seems to be a common theme going with the questions that are being asked here. So one of the questions, I use TurboTax to e-file. I claimed that my parents would file me as one of their dependents, but after talking with them, they agreed not to. Do I need to file an amendment? Okay. What about this question over here? Do you all know if I could still get the $1,200 check if I file an extension and change my status from dependent to independent? I think you mean amendment, but same story. Now, here it says, I said I could be claimed as a dependent but was not claimed. Will I get a stimulus check? All right, so there's definitely a common theme here among these questions, and it looks like now that there's $1,200 at stake, there are a lot of questions as far as who's a dependent, who's not a dependent. Now, I can guarantee you that if there was no stimulus check floating around, this wouldn't be an issue. So this goes back to a similar situation where back in the day, for us tax preparers who are seasoned in this area, we'll remember that at one point on the tax return, you didn't have to put social security numbers for each one of your dependents. So people were claiming all sorts of dependents. Say, this guy Roger is my dependent, this guy Bob is my dependent, Jennifer is my dependent, everybody's my dependent, right? It was just dependents galore on the tax return, right? Because you didn't have to establish any sort of documentation or put their social security number or anything. So every Joe, Tom, Nick, everybody was a dependent. The IRS got tired of this because they realized that everybody was claiming dependents out of nowhere. They were probably making them up. And they revised the Form 1040 to require the social security number of each dependent, along with other information. But what do you think happened? Millions of dependents disappeared off the face of the earth. They ceased to exist as soon as taxpayers had to put their social security numbers, because a lot of them were just lying through their teeth to get additional exemptions and credits and all that sort of stuff based on dependents that, quite frankly, did not exist. So you had that situation. You solved it by putting the requirement to include social security numbers, and millions of dependents disappeared. Now we have a situation where there's a $1,200 payment floating around, and people are now questioning their dependency status. Now, they're asking if they can change whether they're designated as a dependent on their parent's return or not, and it seems like this is a pretty common inquiry that we'll need to address. So let's take a look at where all this even comes from. Now, if we look at the Form 1040, let me switch up the view here. All right, so if we look at the Form 1040, the good old Form 1040 as I like to refer to it, all right, what we'll find is that there's a checkbox that says, quite simply, someone can claim you as a dependent. It doesn't ask you if they did, it asks you if they can. Right, and this comes from really the old rules pertaining to exemptions, whereby you would get that $4,000 some odd dollar exemption if you could not be claimed as a dependent on another's return. But if you can be claimed on their return, then you shouldn't get the exemption. That was the idea. So that's where that comes from. Now, with regard to the rules in particular, so this doesn't matter for this purpose if someone did claim you. It matters if they can claim you. That's what the form is asking. Now, with regard to the exemptions, obviously exemptions as of 2018, they don't apply anymore. There's no exemption on anybody's return. It's essentially been reduced to zero, that whole concept. Now, we have this credit floating around, so let's see how this is going to apply to that. Here we have the United States Senate Committee on Finance frequently asked questions regarding that recovery check that they just released on March 26th. Right now it's March 29th at approximately 3 in the morning. But hey, what would I rather be doing right now than answering tax questions? Nothing. This is what I'd rather be. All right, so the CARES Act, recovery check, frequently asked questions. This is from the Committee on Finance, from the good old Senate, the best Senate that anyone's ever had. My favorite Senate, I will tell you. Okay, so let's take a look at specifically this area. Who qualifies as a child for purposes of the rebate? Because if you remember, qualifying relatives don't allow you to get more of this rebate. It's qualifying children that allow you to increase the amount of the credit that you get. So it says, who qualifies as a child for purposes of the rebate? Any child who is a qualifying child for purposes of the child tax credit is also a qualifying child for purposes of the recovery rebate. In general, a child is any dependent of a taxpayer under the age of 17. Okay, next question. Do dependents other than children under 17 qualify a taxpayer for an additional $500 per dependent? No, the additional $500 per child provision is limited to children under 17. It's pretty clear, all right? They don't want to reward you for housing your deadbeat cousin who's just relaxing at the house. This is not for that. This is for children specifically. And there's another part of this that I want to address, and it is right here. Are college students eligible for a recovery rebate? Only if they're not considered a dependent of their parents. Notice it doesn't say whether or not they're claimed. It's whether or not they're considered. Important distinction. Next, generally, a full-time college student under the age of 24 is considered a dependent if their parents provide more than half of their support. So what they're going for here is they're saying that it's not a matter of who claims who. It's a matter of if they can claim you as a qualifying child, that's where the credit goes, all right? Now, furthermore, I wanted to address here the child tax credit rules, and this comes out of publication 972. This is an IRS publication. Now, it's not authoritative from a technical tax standpoint, but for everyday purposes, we can take a look at this and see what it has to say. Now, qualifying child for the CTC, which is the the child tax credit. I'm going to try to make this so you guys can actually see it. All right, it's going to make it difficult for me, so we're going to do it a different way. 1 second. Whoop. Okay. All right, so we should be able to scroll. You should be able to see. Okay, so qualifying child for the CTC. A child qualifies you because remember, it says here on the United States Senate Committee on Finance frequently asked questions that it depends on which child is a qualifying child for purposes of the child tax credit. That's why we're looking at this now. All right, qualifying child for the CTC. A child qualifies you for the CTC if the child meets all of the following conditions. The child is your son, daughter, stepchild, eligible foster child, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister. You can read the rest of them. Next, the child was under age 17 at the end of 2019. Third, the child did not provide over half of his or her own support for 2019. Four, the child lived with you for more than half of 2019. 5, the child is claimed as a dependent on your return. 6, the child does not file a joint return for the year. And if they file, it's only for a refund of tax withheld. And the child was a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, U.S. resident, alien. So all these requirements basically come into play for purposes of the child tax credit. So it's safe bet to say, based on what we read here and what's in this frequently asked questions, that if you can be claimed as a qualifying child of your parents, then you don't have a choice as to whether you file as a dependent or not as a dependent, because it's determined by the facts and circumstances. It's not a choice. All right. So if they can claim, if you're a qualifying child based on the facts and circumstances of your parents, they get the credit. All right. And with regard to whether you claim yourself as a dependent or not, from the exemption standpoint, which is not applicable anymore because exemptions have been reduced to 0, that used to matter a lot more. Now, basically, if you're going for education credit, whereby you still would qualify as a dependent of someone else, as long as they don't claim you and you claim yourself as someone that can't be a dependent of someone else, then you may qualify for some educational credits and benefits there. But in terms of this situation right here with the rebate payment, with the stimulus payment for coronavirus, you need to be a dependent. If you are dependent under the facts and circumstances, you have no choice as to who claims who. If your parents can claim you as a qualifying child, then they're going to get this stimulus payment, and there's really no flexibility there. Hopefully this helps answer the multitude of questions that were asked regarding this situation. I'm sure there are going to be a lot more, but with regard to how this is structured, they're really trying to allow these benefits to go to certain individuals, and one of their focuses are parents that have to support another individual being a qualifying child. So in that situation, they're going to definitely want to allocate it that way and not have just people not acknowledging that their parents can claim them and filing returns as if they're not a dependent of another. So hopefully this helps add some clarity to this craziness. This is still a developing situation, and there may be some updates in this regard as far as how things play out. But at the end of the day, hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching.